Hi, I'm Dan Sowden from Ray White, and welcome to this week's edition of The Gavel. Now, earlier this year, the Queensland Government introduced a raft of legislation changes that come into effect a little later this year that will have a significant impact on the way we manage investment properties. Now, according to the most recent census, around 31% of all households are renters. So this latest legislation is going to have a significant impact on the way we manage and rent properties in Queensland. So let's get straight into it. There are four major elements to the rental reforms: domestic and family violence, pets, there's new grounds for lease termination and changes to periodic tenancies, and minimum housing standards. So this will be a slightly longer video, so in the comment section below we'll place a timeline for each of these sections so you can skip forward or back if you choose to as well. Now, the first section relates to domestic and family violence. Now, this reform is really one that sits in the common sense column, where if a tenant sadly becomes a victim of domestic and family violence, then they're able to terminate their tenancy agreement with just 7 days notice. This means that they are not liable for any reletting or vacancy costs or any damage caused by any violence that happened at the property. All they need to do is provide 7 days notice, providing supporting documentation such as a domestic and family violence report, ensure that the rent is paid up to date at the vacate date. Now, commonly, the majority of owners that we work with are understanding and will generally waive all lease obligations in this event. This particular part of the reform simply clears up this area and crystallises the options any tenant and victim of domestic and family violence has. Pets. Now, this is probably the most topical of reforms and the most challenging for owners. Now, as of the 1st of October this year, owners can no longer have a no pets policy, meaning that owners cannot simply say no pets. So, how does this work? First of all, tenants will seek approval via a new pet request form. Now, the owner must comply within 14 days, otherwise it's taken as approved. Owners can only decline the pet request with specific grounds or certain circumstances. Now, these circumstances include the property is not adequately fenced, there's potential damage to the property would be in advance of the bond, for example, if you have hardwood timber floors, or it's against body corporate law or local government law to house that number of pets, or simply it's unsafe to do so. So essentially, if you don't have specific grounds, then you cannot refuse the pet request and you must accept it. The good news for owners is that you may include special conditions for the pet approval, which is then amended to your lease. Commonly, these conditions to having a pet would include having the carpets professionally cleaned, and of course having the property fumigated at the end of the lease. Further, the legislation also clarifies that pet damage is now excluded from the definition of wear and tear, and that the tenant accepts that any and all damage caused by the pet during the tenancy is their responsibility. So with this acknowledgement, there's also no pet bond, meaning that you can't ask as a landlord for an extra 2 to 4 weeks rent of bond to cover any future or potential pet damage. So, changes to periodic tenancies. Now, property owners now have lost the right to simply end a periodic tenancy by providing notice. This means that if the tenancy started as a fixed term, then rolled over to a periodic lease, the owner can no longer simply give 4 weeks notice to the tenant to vacate unless there are specific grounds. Now, these grounds or circumstances include the following: the sale of a property, the owner moving in, conducting major renovations or demolition, and or a material change of use. Now, please note that Section 365D of the legislation prescribes that if the landlord could be liable for potential damages and penalty if they're found to be reletting the property in a period of 6 months after giving notice on specific grounds. So the fine is up to $7,000. It's important to remember that the notice to leave for a tenant on a periodic lease remains at just 2 weeks. Now, we see the biggest challenge for landlords around the periodic lease is that the potential impact on landlords' insurance policies. Now, these policies generally have a loss of rent provision that extends to the end of the lease, meaning that if you have an insurance event and the lease is on a periodic basis, then the maximum payout you would see would be just 2 weeks' rent, which is hardly enough time to complete repairs and cover any loss of rent that you would have are received over that period of time, and of course the reletting costs. So when it comes time to managing the leases, we see that there is no room for complacency, meaning that if you don't follow up with the lease renewal process and you or your agent also didn't end the fixed term tenancy on the correct date, and that the property then rolls over to a periodic lease, then the lease is said to be periodic and you have to accept this as it is. The minimum housing standard is the reform that we believe will have the greatest and widespread impact on the industry, and most importantly, the condition of investment properties. So this reform commences for all new leases formed from the 1st of September next year, 2023, and all tenancies from the 1st of September 2024. So there's plenty of time to prepare for this one. There are now 9 main standards that need to be kept when it comes to properties, and they're all contained in the cheat sheet saved in the comments below. But there are 4 major elements that I wanted to cover off today. First of all, the property needs to be waterproof and structurally sound, meaning that there are no leaks in doors and windows, and that all the structures of the property are in good repair and not likely to cause further damage or danger to the occupant. We see this specifically referring to timber decks or timber fences that experience water damage and then subsequent wood rot. The second provision is a simple but complex one, in that locks on doors and windows need to be working at all times with keys available as well. The third provision relates to privacy, and that all windows need to have covering across them, all windows, curtains and blinds, specifically when it relates to privacy matters. And the fourth provision relates to kitchen and laundry facilities need to be in working order, specifically referencing the cooktop and oven in the kitchen. Now, where these standards get a little jazzy is where the tenant can treat any repairs or maintenance to these minimum housing standards as if they are an emergency repair, meaning the tenant can action the works directly. Now further, the tenant, like the agent, also has the scope to spend up to the cost of 4 weeks' rent without consultation, meaning that in practical terms, if the locks fail after hours, the tenant may contact the locksmith directly and complete the repairs, or if the oven breaks down, the tenant may contact the electrician, or secondly, replace the oven as long as those costs are under the 4 weeks rent threshold. Now, there are a number of other handful of amendments as mentioned earlier, and these are all detailed in the cheat sheet below. However, the one that is of significance relates to when a new tenant moves into the property for the first time. The first thing now is that they have 7 days, not 3, to complete and return a copy of the entry condition report. Now this is tricky because the condition report is then reflective of what 7 days into the tenancy looks like and after the tenant has actually moved in. And secondly, if the tenant is not happy with the condition of the property, then they can provide notice to leave within 7 days of the commencement of the lease to vacate without penalty. Well, as you've heard now, there are some significant changes coming for the rental industry, and while the bulk of these won't really have too much effect on landlords that employ professional management teams and have a well-maintained property, it certainly will have an impact on perhaps those self-managed properties or properties that have been poorly kept over a period of time and without regular maintenance. Well, I hope you enjoyed this latest edition of the Gavel, and we look forward to seeing you at one of our upcoming open homes or auctions. The cheat sheets are below in the comment section, so feel free to reach out if you have any questions on this raft of new legislative changes.